Hi guys, Howard here with beginning jazz guitar. So excuse the word dribble for a little bit if you will, but I get a lot of people asking about getting started on jazz guitar. In fact, it's a big thing over the years in my private instruction. Guys will come in, they've been playing for 5 years, maybe 10 years, but they've never gotten into jazz and they just want to know the basics, the fundamentals and how to get it going, and then they can just snowball from there if they want to. So I'm going to share with you how I've taught it to my students over the years, what I think is the best way to get started on beginning jazz guitar. Now, I've covered a lot of this material in previous lessons in a different way, but not specifically focusing totally on jazz, okay? So bear with me while we go through some basic fundamentals and then we'll get things moving, okay? So the first thing we want to do is we want to take a look at a basic C major scale because it's the root of everything. So the notes in the C major scale are, of course, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and then C again. And you can play it in 2 octaves if you want with any fingering you choose. Any fingering at all. You can go crazy, actually. But the most important thing that we're going to be discussing here is that for each note in the scale, this is basic music theory, there's a corresponding chord. Some of the chords will be majors and some of the chords will be minors because the scale dictates that, okay? Now, the easiest way to remember this is that the 1, the 4, and the 5 are always majors, and then the remaining chords are minors. If it was a minor scale, you would flip that on its head. The 1, the 4, and the 5 would all be minor chords, and the rest would be majors. Okay, but for our basic beginning jazz lesson here, the first chord is based on a C major. The second chord is based on a D minor. Third on an E minor. Fourth, F. Fifth, G. Sixth, A. That's also the relative minor. And then B is actually based on a B diminished, or in our case, a half diminished chord, which I will explain in a second. Now, as a rule of thumb, not entirely, but for the most part, in jazz, they rarely play anything smaller than a 7th. So instead of just a C chord, it's going to be a C major 7th. Instead of a D minor chord, it'll be a D minor 7th, and so on. So that's the first thing we want to get together. That's just the very basics of jazz, is learning your major and your minor 7th chords, eventually in multiple fingerings on the fretboard, but that would be for another lesson, although I might touch on it a little bit here. So for our purposes, the first chord is C major 7. The second chord is D minor 7, E minor 7, F major 7, G dominant 7th, A minor 7, B minor 7 flat 5 or half diminished, and then finally back to C major 7. Now, you can play these chords with different fingerings, which I'll probably talk about a little bit, but what we're getting into right now is just traversing the scale with those chords, and you can literally hear the scale go by in chords. And again, you can play these chords in different ways. You can play a C major 7 open. You can, of course, play a D minor 7 here. Different ways to play an E minor 7, F major 7, G dominant 7th, A minor 7, B minor 7 flat 5. But I'm not getting into all that just yet, just trying to make a point that you can play these chords differently. But we're going to do it this way, so again, we can ascend the scale and descend as well. Now, 2 things I consider really important in understanding the basics of jazz guitar is, again, how to play all those chords, which chords belong to the key that we're in this case C major, And then you want to know the arpeggios, the classic standard jazz arpeggios for each of those chords. But I'm also interested in, and I think it's vitally important to understand the corresponding mode as well. So you have the chord, the arpeggio, and the mode that accompanies it all, okay? So for the C major 7, we have a C major 7 arpeggio, and I will show you 2 ways to play this particular arpeggio. So we have a C major 7 chord, and then we have a C major 7 arpeggio. I'll do that again nice and slow. So the arpeggio, of course, outlines just the notes that are in the chord, but in an ascending and descending order, okay? Low to high, high to low. Okay, so we move to the D minor 7 chord, and we have an arpeggio to go with that chord as well. So let me do that one nice and slow. Now when we move to the E minor 7, which is the exact same chord shape, that would mean that the arpeggio is the exact same chord shape. So we just take that arpeggio and move it up a whole step. Now we move to an F major 7 chord. And again, this is another major 7th arpeggio, and I'll show you a second fingering, as I mentioned, for a major 7th arpeggio. That's a nice fingering because you can fall into the mode or scale patterns within it pretty easily. So again, just to review, if you've got a C major 7th here, you could use that same fingering right underneath the chord. If you were playing, for instance, this C major 7, you might want to use that fingering. So you have multiple choices there, okay? Okay, so moving through the scale, we arrive at the G dominant 7th chord, and we're most likely to play it more like this. And the arpeggio is like so. Cool sounding arpeggio. And then we move to A minor 7, and again you're most likely going to play it in one of these other forms, and the arpeggio is this. Nice and slow. Okay, and then we move to the B minor 7 flat 5. Most likely going to be played this way, although that's pretty common as well. And we have a really cool sounding arpeggio for this as well. Very cool. And that brings us right back home to the C major 7. So again, these chords, basic, major, and minor 7ths, and their corresponding arpeggios is very, very important, okay? So I will talk briefly, and I'm just going to do this without a lot of tab or chord diagrams. I'm just going to explain it verbally and visually, that it's important to know different ways to play these chords, okay? So most of these chord shapes, in fact all of them that I'm going to show you, maybe all of them, are movable chord shapes, okay? So we know that this is a C major 7, and that's a movable chord. It becomes a D major 7, E major 7, F major 7, and so forth and so on. So that's a nice shape to know. It's a pretty common way to play a major 7th chord, but there are other ways to play a major 7th chord. For instance, off of the 6th string, this will be a G major 7, 3rd fret, 6th string, skip a string and go 4 and 4 with these fingers across the D and the G string, and then get your second finger into the 3rd fret on the B string. Mute out the A string and avoid the first E string. And that's a movable shape as well. So that's pretty handy to know. And you can go to town on some cocktail jazz. All right, so let's look at a few more ways to play some major sevenths, okay? One of my favorite ways to play a major seven is like this. I think that's a really sweet sound, okay? This is a D major seventh, for instance. There's the root note. So it's 5th fret on the D string, 5th fret on the A string, 4th fret on the D string, and then bar the remaining strings, or even all 4, okay? And that's nice because you can move fingers around within the chord. And again, a movable chord shape. Very nice sounding. And if you take it right off the fretboard, you have that C major 7 in an open position, which sounds really sweet. And yet another way to play a major 7th chord. This is a G major 7th, for instance. There's your root right there. 2nd fret on the 1st E string, 3rd on the B, 4th on the G, 5th on the D. And again, all movable, okay? Here's another way to play that G major 7th, and this is movable as well. 5th fret on the D string with your 1st finger, and then bar the first 3 strings at the 7th fret. So there's a few ways to play major 7ths. And it's interesting because a lot of times with jazz guys, for instance, they'll do a lot of comping in the rhythm. You'll hear a lot of stuff going on that sounds really cool, and it sounds like they're playing tons of chords, right? But they might actually just be playing a couple of chords, you know, comping back and forth, but using these different inversions. So let's say if they were messing about with that little groove I was doing earlier. You know, just bouncing between a G major 7 and a C major 7, but what you might hear is, you see what I mean? It's really just the same 2 chords, but with all these different inversions and fingerings, and it sounds pretty cool indeed. So as I mentioned earlier, another part that I consider really important is knowing those standard major and minor 7th jazz chords with their corresponding arpeggios, and then knowing the mode underneath the chord that you're playing. I think that's really important because if you're using a diatonic chord progression, staying in the same key, in other words, you can kind of chord chase and play lines that really go with whatever the chord progression happens to be, okay? So let's go back to that C major 7 and take a look at it. Now, the corresponding mode right underneath that chord, and a mode is a scale, okay? We've got our major and our minor scales, and I won't go into detail about the modes here, but the modes are the scales in between those two. That's one way you can look at it. I'll get into modes more heavy later on. But we've got a C major scale, or excuse me, a C major chord. We know the arpeggio. And this is the scale or mode that best suits it, which would simply be the C major scale, which is also known as an Ionian mode. And you can combine that bits and pieces of the mode with the arpeggio, and you get some really nice sounds. And you can look at these for now, not theoretically, but as shapes, okay? And this is something that I do with my students. I like to teach the modes to them as shapes, and then you can travel the theoretical road later on if you'd like. But if you know the shape of each of these modes, then you can play these modes all over the fretboard off of any chord and in any key without having to break it down theoretically, right? It's all about shapes and patterns. So if you know that this is a major chord shape or a major scale shape, then that's what it is all over the fretboard. Now you know an Ionian mode all over the fretboard. That's my point about that, okay? So if we move to the D minor 7th chord, we have what's called a Dorian mode. And what we're doing there is we're moving from D to D, but within the key of C. So we're playing D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, okay? Again, not getting into the modes theoretically here, but that is, again, the shape of a Dorian mode. Wherever you play it, that's the shape of a Dorian mode, and that's really valuable to know, okay? You got the chord, you have the arpeggio. So you've got all of that right underneath your fingers, right underneath the chord. We move to E minor 7, and we know the arpeggio, and that's what's called a Phrygian mode. And you can combine that with the arpeggio as well. Now we move to the F major 7 chord, and we know we have the arpeggio for that. And we have what's called the Lydian mode. And of course we can combine with the mode as well, okay? And then we move to that G dominant 7th chord. We've got the arpeggio. And we have what's called the Mixolydian scale or mode. And of course, as I said, you can play these in multiple fingerings. I'll leave that for another time, but for right now, again. All right. Then we move to the A minor 7 chord. We've got the arpeggio, of course. And we've got the Aeolian mode, or the natural minor scale, actually. And then we move to the B minor 7 flat 5. And we have the Locrian mode. And we wind up right back at C major 7. So there you go with my beginning jazz guitar lesson, okay? Vitally important, major and minor 7ths, because they are just sort of the framework, if you will, of jazz. And of course, jazz can get very extreme when it comes to chord voicings, and it's a wonderful style of music to explore. And so major and minor 7ths, the corresponding arpeggios, and the modes, okay? So for instance, if you were traveling from F major 7th to D minor 7 to maybe C major 7, you've got access to those arpeggios to get inside those chords and really bring them out. But you've also got the modes, and you can combine things together in different ways. And the mode will capture the chord as well. And then the arpeggios. Lydian, Dorian, Ionian, and the arpeggios in combination. So there you go with a beginning jazz guitar, the way I've always liked to teach it to my students. And then from there, you can just go and go and go and learning some of the great jazz standards, you know, Miles Davis's stuff, Bill Evans, Wayne Shorter, the list goes on and on and on. There's a wealth of beautiful chords and musical knowledge to be had for those who enjoy it and seek it out. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed it. All the best to everyone, as I always say, and we will see you guys in the next video. Hi guys, Howard here with part 3 of my jazz guitar lessons. Parts 1 and 2 have really been enjoyed by a lot of viewers, especially the first one. And a lot of viewers wanted more, okay? So if you haven't checked out parts 1 and 2, you might want to do that first before moving on to this lesson here, okay? Now, what I'm going to be talking about in this particular lesson is what is called shell chords. You may have heard that term. What these actually are guide tone chords, but a lot of players just refer to them as shell chords. They only contain 3 notes, but the 3 most important notes, the first, the third, and the 7th, okay? And the 7th will vary depending on the chord, a dominant 7th, a major 7th, a minor 7th, but we will talk about all of that. But the first thing I'm going to do is relate it to the very first jazz guitar lesson, part 1 in this series, okay? So we're going to be in the key of C, and in that first lesson we mapped out that the chords in the key of C now those are big voicings, right? Those are 6-string or at least 5-string voicings. So with shell chords, like I said, we're just playing what might be called the king, queen, and prince notes of the chord. So for that first major 7th, C major 7th, we're simply playing this. And there's different ways that you can play these chords. If you're using your fingers, you can play them finger style, and that also allows you to do things like kind of pluck the chord out, put the bass note in front of it. That type of thing. But you can also play them with a pick. You can hybrid pick them. Same idea. Or anything you want to do is perfectly acceptable. But the point is that you're just playing those 3 notes. The first, the third, and the 7th, okay? So in the key of C, referring back to the first jazz guitar lesson, we have these chords. C major 7, this would be the D minor 7, E minor 7, F major 7, G dominant 7th, A minor 7, and then for the B minor 7 flat 5, you can play the same thing, or you can play, which some players would prefer to do to get that flat 5 in there. So that travels right up the scale. Right? So that gives you your minor and major 7th shapes off of the 5th string, the A string. Dominant 7th as well. But what I'm going to show you here is how to do that off of the 6th string, as well as the 5th string like we just did, and also off of the 4th string, okay? To know these shapes off of each one of those strings is a really important thing for anyone getting into jazz guitar, okay? It's sort of the basics of it, really, okay? So this is how you play a major 7th off of the 6th string. So this would be a G major 7th. I'm at the 3rd fret. So we have a G major 7th, and then we have the C major 7th we just played. And then off of the 4th string, the D string, we would have, and that would be an F major 7th, whatever your root tone is. And of course, all of these chords are movable, right? So those are your major 7ths off of the E, the A, and the D strings, okay? Really cool stuff to know. Now, You also want to know how to play your minor sevenths, okay? So we'll do that as well. Minor sevenths off of the 6th string are, or you can play them like that. That would be a G minor 7th. Then of course the shape we've already done would be a C major 7th. Okay, and then a minor 7th off of the D string. That would be an F minor 7th, right? So now we've got major and minor 7ths off of those 3 strings. So now let's talk about dominant 7ths, okay? So a G dominant 7th would be, and then a C dominant 7th would be, and then an F dominant 7th would be. Now that's actually 4 strings, so I'm sort of breaking the rules there, but I think it sounds better. You can just play that or just that, but I think that the dominant 7th off of the D really sounds best as a 4-string chord. Now again, that's just major 7ths, minor 7ths, and dominant 7ths, okay? But off of those 3 strings, which I think is really important. There are many more shell chords, okay? We're just scratching the surface here. This is beginning jazz guitar after all. But mastering those shapes and knowing them in the different keys is really important. We know that it's major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, and minor 7th flat 5, right? So you kind of want to know that in all the keys if you can, but it's pretty easy to map out just using the shape of a major scale. So for instance, in the key of G, we would have G, A, B, C, D, E, and F sharp. And we would apply that rule of thumb to it. Major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, minor 7th flat 5. So for the key of G, we would have G major 7, A minor 7, B minor 7, C major 7, D dominant 7th, E minor 7, F sharp minor 7 flat 5, and back to G major 7. So you can really see the advantage of knowing how to play these chords off of those 3 strings as a starting point, right? So you could play an E minor 7 to an A dominant 7th, to a D major 7, to a G major 7, C7 sharp 9, you might know the tune I'm mapping out here, F7, F sharp 7, B minor to B7. Right? Playing the changes of Spain, for instance. Pretty fun stuff once you get into it. And again, this is just scratching the surface of shell chords. There are many more that you can play. And you guys can let me know if you'd like to know more about them, and I will put it all together for you, okay? Hope you enjoyed it. Part 3 of Beginning Jazz Guitar. We'll see you guys soon.